Good evening, night owls and dream wanderers. Welcome back to another journey through the shadows of history. Another tale whispered in the darkness, where legends are born not from noise, but from silence. Tonight we walk through the life of a man who understood that true power doesn't announce itself with gunfire or headlines. True power moves like smoke through the streets, invisible but everywhere. True power speaks in whispers that echo louder than any shout. Tonight we discover Carlo Gambino. Picture, if you will, the streets of Brooklyn in the 1950s. Steam rises from manholes like incense in a concrete cathedral. Neon signs flicker in the distance, casting colored shadows on wet pavement. In the back rooms of restaurants that never close, in the corners of social clubs where old men play cards by lamplight, decisions are being made that will shape America itself. And at the center of it all sits a small, quiet man with gentle eyes and hands that have never needed to hold a gun to command absolute loyalty. Carlo Gambino, the man they would call the boss of bosses, the architect of the modern American mafia, the godfather who ruled not through fear, but through respect, cunning, and an almost supernatural patience. But Carlo Gambino was not born a king. He was not handed power on a silver platter. He was forged in the ancient fires of Sicily, tempered by poverty, shaped by tradition, and polished by decades of careful observation and strategic thinking that would make chess masters weep with envy. So settle back into your pillows tonight. Let the world outside fade away. We're about to begin a journey through nearly 8 decades of American history, following the quiet footsteps of a man who walked among giants and outlasted them all. This is the story of how a shepherd's son from a dusty Sicilian village became the most powerful crime boss in the history of the United States. This is the story of Carlo Gambino, the quiet godfather. The year is 1902. The place is Palermo, Sicily, where the Mediterranean sun beats down on ancient cobblestone streets that have witnessed the rise and fall of empires. Here in this crossroads of civilizations, where Arab, Norman, and Spanish influences blend like watercolors in the rain, a child is born who will one day command an empire of his own. Carlo Gambino enters the world on August 24th in the Passo di Rigano neighborhood of Palermo. His father Tommaso tends sheep in the hills surrounding the city. His mother Felice keeps house and raises children with the iron discipline and fierce love that Sicilian mothers are legendary for. They are poor, but they are proud. They are humble, but they understand honor. In 1902, Sicily is not the tourist paradise of postcards and romance novels. It is a harsh land where survival depends on understanding the unwritten rules that govern life and death. The official government in Rome is distant and largely irrelevant. The real law comes from the ancient code of the island, a code that values silence above speech, loyalty above law, and family above everything else in the world. Young Carlo grows up in this atmosphere, like a plant growing in volcanic soil, rich with the nutrients of tradition and danger. The poverty of his family is not unique. Most Sicilians live with little, but they live with dignity. They understand that a man's word is his bond, that respect is earned through actions rather than boasts, and that the greatest strength often comes wrapped in the quietest packages. As a boy, Carlo is unremarkable to most who see him. He is small for his age, with dark eyes that watch everything and reveal nothing. While other children play loudly in the streets, Carlo observes. He learns to read people the way his father reads the sky for signs of weather. He discovers that information is more valuable than gold, that patience is more powerful than passion, and that the ability to remain silent is the rarest and most precious skill a man can possess. The Sicily of Carlo's childhood is governed by unspoken hierarchies. There are the landed gentry who own vast estates. There are the gabellodi, the estate managers who serve as intermediaries between owners and workers. There are the field hands who work for daily bread. And moving through all these layers like shadows at twilight are the men of respect, the ones who settle disputes that the distant government cannot or will not address. Carlo's family occupies the lowest rung of this social ladder, but even in poverty, they maintain their dignity. His father, Tommaso, is known as an honest man, a hard worker who keeps his word and expects others to keep theirs. His mother, Felice, runs her household with quiet efficiency, teaching her children that cleanliness is next to godliness, and that family loyalty is the foundation upon which all other virtues rest. But Sicily in the early 1900s offers little opportunity for honest men with strong backs and empty pockets. The island's feudal system is crumbling, but nothing has risen to replace it except uncertainty and desperation. Young men with ambition and no connections find themselves facing a choice: accept a life of backbreaking, labor for subsistence wages, or look for alternatives that exist in the shadows between legal and illegal, acceptable and forbidden. Carlo watches as older relatives make these choices. He sees some men choose the path of resignation, bending their backs to other men's fields until they die forgotten. He sees others choose the path of desperation, taking risks that lead to prison or early graves. But he also sees a third path, walked by men who speak softly and carry themselves with quiet authority, men who seem to have influence far beyond their apparent station in life. These men understand something that escapes both the completely honest and the completely criminal, that in a world where official law is weak and corrupt, there is room for those who create their own order, their own justice, their own systems of protection and mutual aid. They are not bandits who steal from the innocent, but neither are they sheep who allow themselves to be stolen from. They occupy a middle ground that requires intelligence, restraint, and a deep understanding of human nature. Young Carlo Gambino studies these men with the same intensity that other boys study their catechisms. He learns that true strength is not displayed through violence, but through the credible threat of violence, held in reserve like a sword that never needs to be drawn, because everyone knows it is there. He learns that the most powerful words are often unspoken, that the most binding agreements are sealed with a handshake rather than a signature, and that reputation is a man's most valuable possession because it is the one thing that cannot be stolen, only lost through his own actions. As Carlo enters his teenage years, the old world of Sicily is beginning to crack. The feudal estates are being broken up. Traditional authority structures are weakening. And across the Atlantic Ocean, stories filter back of a place called America, where a man with intelligence and determination can rise far beyond the circumstances of his birth. But Carlo Gambino is not a dreamer who believes in fairy tales. Even as a young man, he possesses an almost frightening clarity about the nature of power and opportunity. He understands that America may offer more chances than Sicily, but it will still be a world where strength respects strength, where the clever prey upon the foolish, and where success belongs to those who can navigate both the official rules and the shadow, rules that really govern human behavior. In 1921, at the age of 19, Carlo makes the decision that will change not only his own life, but the entire landscape of American organized crime. He decides to join the great migration of Sicilians seeking opportunity in the New World. But unlike many who flee poverty with nothing but hope, Carlo carries with him something far more valuable: a deep understanding of how power really works, learned in the ancient school of Sicilian streets. The young man who boards the ship in Palermo harbor is still physically small, still quiet, still given to watching rather than talking. But behind those dark eyes burns an intelligence and ambition that will soon make him one of the most powerful men in America. He is leaving behind the poverty of his childhood, but he has taken with him the lessons of Sicily, that family is everything, that respect is earned and never given, that the most dangerous enemies are often the ones who smile the most, and that in a world where might makes right, the mightiest are often those who appear the meekest. as his ship disappears over the horizon heading west toward the land of opportunity. Carlo Gambino is already planning not just his survival, but his conquest of a new world. The Statue of Liberty rises from New York Harbor like a promise carved in copper and stone. But for Carlo Gambino, standing on the deck of his ship in 1921, freedom means something different than it does for most immigrants. Freedom means the opportunity to apply the lessons of Sicily to the boundless possibilities of America. Ellis Island processes thousands of hopeful souls every day in 1921, and to the immigration officials, 19-year-old Carlo appears to be just another young Italian seeking honest work in America's booming economy. He is small, quiet, polite, and carries the required documentation. Nothing about him suggests that they are admitting someone who will one day command an organization more powerful than most corporations, more disciplined than most armies, and more enduring than most governments. Carlo's first home in America is Brooklyn, specifically the neighborhood of East New York, where Sicilian immigrants cluster together like flowers in a familiar garden. Here the old country lives on in the sound of dialect spoken on street corners, in the smell of traditional food cooking in tiny kitchens, and in the unspoken understandings that govern relationships between families who have known each other for generations. But this is not the old country, and Carlo quickly realizes that America requires adaptation. The official economy offers opportunities that never existed in Sicily. A clever man can start with nothing and build a legitimate business through hard work and smart decisions. At the same time, America's vast size and relatively weak law enforcement create opportunities for those willing to operate outside official boundaries. Carlo finds work first as a dock laborer, loading and unloading ships at the Brooklyn waterfront. The work is backbreaking, but it provides something more valuable than wages: an education in how America really operates. The docks are controlled not by the shipping companies or the government, but by a complex web of unions, political organizations, and informal power structures that echo the systems he knew in Sicily. On the waterfront, Carlo observes that the same principles apply as in the old country. Information is power. Relationships matter more than rules. And the ability to provide protection and solve problems creates influence that cannot be purchased with money alone. He watches longshoremen who earn respect not through their physical strength, but through their connections. He sees union officials who live better than company executives because they understand how to make themselves indispensable to both workers and management. Most importantly, Carlo recognizes that the American dream is not just about individual success, but about creating systems that generate ongoing prosperity for those smart enough to position themselves at the right intersections of need and opportunity. While other immigrants focus on working hard for wages, Carlo begins to think like an entrepreneur, identifying inefficiencies in the system that can be addressed by someone with the right combination of intelligence, discretion, and moral flexibility. It is during these early years on the waterfront that Carlo first encounters members of what the newspapers are beginning to call the Mafia, though the men themselves never use that term. To them, they are simply Sicilian Americans who understand that success in America requires the same virtues that ensured survival in the old country: loyalty, honor, silence, and the ability to handle problems that official authorities cannot or will not address. Carlo recognizes kindred spirits in these men, but he also recognizes that many of them are making the same mistake that destroyed similar organizations back in Sicily. They are too visible, too dramatic, too quick to resort to violence as a solution to problems that could be solved more elegantly through patience and intelligence. The American press is beginning to sensationalize stories of Italian-American crime, and Carlo instinctively understands that this attention is dangerous for everyone involved. Through his cousin Paul Castellano, who had arrived in America several years earlier, Carlo is introduced to members of the Mangano crime family, one of several Sicilian American organizations that have established themselves in New York's underworld. The Manganos control various illegal enterprises, from bootlegging during Prohibition to gambling and loan sharking. But they also maintain interests in legitimate businesses including restaurants, construction, and waste management. Vincent Mangano, the family's leader, is a man of the old school, someone who believes in maintaining strict boundaries between the criminal organization and the legitimate community. Under his leadership, the family operates with a level of discipline and discretion that appeals to Carlo's sensibilities. Unlike some of the flashier gangsters who are making headlines, Mangano understands that the most profitable crimes are the ones that never make the newspapers. Carlo begins his criminal career not as a gunman or an enforcer, but as a problem solver and relationship builder. His quiet manner and apparent humility make him non-threatening to established members, while his intelligence and reliability make him valuable for handling sensitive matters that require discretion rather than force. His first assignments involve mediating disputes between different factions within the Italian-American community, resolving conflicts that might otherwise escalate into violence that would attract unwanted police attention. Carlo discovers that he has a natural talent for this work. He can listen to both sides of a dispute, identify the underlying interests that are really at stake, and craft solutions that allow everyone involved to maintain their dignity while achieving their essential goals. This diplomatic approach to problem solving becomes Carlo's signature throughout his career. While other gangsters rely on intimidation and violence, Carlo builds his reputation on his ability to find peaceful solutions to apparently impossible conflicts. He understands that violence is sometimes necessary, but he also understands that it should be used like a surgeon's scalpel rather than a butcher's cleaver. Precisely, reluctantly, and only when no other option exists. During these early years in the Mangano family, Carlo also begins to build the network of relationships that will eventually make him the most powerful crime boss in America. He cultivates friendships with other young Sicilian Americans who share his combination of ambition and intelligence. He maintains connections with relatives still in Sicily, understanding that the old country remains a source of both opportunity and potential threats. Most importantly, he begins to develop contacts in the legitimate world: politicians, judges, police officials, businessmen, and union leaders who can provide information, influence, and protection in exchange for various forms of assistance. Carlo's approach to these relationships is masterful in its subtlety. He never asks for favors directly, but instead positions himself as someone who can solve problems and create opportunities for others. A judge facing financial difficulties might find himself offered a perfectly legal consulting opportunity. A police captain might discover that information he provides about upcoming raids is rewarded by the mysterious disappearance of problems in his personal life. A businessman might learn that his relationship with Carlo provides protection against both criminal predators and bureaucratic harassment. By the late 1920s, Carlo Gambino has transformed himself from a dock worker to a trusted member of one of New York's most powerful crime families. He has never been arrested, never been publicly associated with any criminal activity, and never attracted the attention of law enforcement or the press. To outside observers, he appears to be nothing more than a quiet, hard-working Italian-American who has achieved modest success in legitimate business. But within the shadowy world of organized crime, Carlo is already recognized as a rising star. His ability to generate income without creating problems, to solve conflicts without resorting to violence, and to maintain absolute discretion about sensitive matters has made him invaluable to the Mangano leadership. More importantly, it has earned him the respect of members from other families who see in Carlo a new type of criminal leader, one who understands that the future belongs not to the loudest or the most violent, but to the smartest and the most patient. As the 1920s draw to a close, and America prepares to enter the turbulent decade of the 1930s, Carlo Gambino stands at the threshold of greatness. He has mastered the art of operating in the shadows while maintaining a respectable public facade. He has built relationships that span both the criminal underworld and the legitimate overworld. Most importantly, he has learned to think not just tactically about individual opportunities, but strategically about long-term positioning in a constantly changing environment. The quiet young man from Sicily is about to become a major player in the most significant reorganization of American organized crime in the 20th century. But even as opportunity calls, Carlo remains true to his fundamental principles. Watch more than you speak, think more than you act, and never forget that in both Sicily and America, patience is the virtue that separates the wise from the merely clever. The year 1930 arrives in New York like a storm gathering on a distant horizon. To most Americans, it brings the beginning of the Great Depression, a time of economic hardship that will test the resilience of the nation. But within the Sicilian American underworld, 1930 marks the beginning of something far more dramatic. A war that will reshape organized crime in America and provide Carlo Gambino with the opportunity to demonstrate the strategic brilliance that has been developing quietly within him for nearly a decade. The conflict that historians will later call the Castellammarese War has its roots in the ancient feuds of Sicily, but its immediate cause is the collision between Old World traditions and New World opportunities. On one side stands Joe the Boss Masseria, a crude but powerful crime lord who controls much of New York's Italian-American underworld through a combination of violence and political corruption. Masseria represents the old way of doing things, loud, brutal, and ultimately self-destructive. Opposing Masseria is Salvatore Maranzano, a sophisticated Sicilian who arrived in America with grand ambitions and a detailed understanding of military strategy. Maranzano dreams of creating a national crime syndicate organized along the lines of ancient Roman legions with himself as the supreme commander. He represents a different approach to criminal leadership, disciplined, hierarchical, and strategically minded. Between these two titans stands a generation of younger men who will ultimately determine the future of American organized crime. Men like Lucky Luciano, Frank Costello, Vito Genovese, and Carlo Gambino himself. These are not the crude street thugs of popular imagination, but intelligent, ambitious individuals who understand that the coming conflict will create opportunities for those clever enough to position themselves correctly. Carlo Gambino enters this period as a respected but relatively junior member of the Mangano family, which has aligned itself with the Maranzano faction. But Carlo's true loyalty is not to either side in the war, but to his own vision of what organized crime could become in America. He sees the conflict not as a battle between good and evil, but as a necessary period of creative destruction that will clear away the old, inefficient power structures and create space for something new and better. Throughout the war, which rages from 1930 to 1931, Carlo demonstrates the strategic patience that will become his trademark. While other young gangsters choose sides early and commit themselves fully to their chosen leaders, Carlo maintains a more flexible position. He performs his duties loyally for the Mangano family and the Maranzano faction, but he also maintains quiet communications with members of the opposing side. This is not betrayal in Carlo's mind, but rather intelligent preparation for the inevitable post-war period when the survivors will need to work together to rebuild what the conflict has destroyed. He understands that wars end, but the men who survive them must continue to coexist and cooperate. By maintaining relationships across factional lines, Carlo is positioning himself to play a leadership role in whatever new order emerges from the chaos. The war itself is brutal but brief. Both sides employ assassination, kidnapping, and terrorism to weaken their opponents. Longtime friends become mortal enemies. Families are torn apart by competing loyalties. The Italian-American neighborhoods of New York become battlefields where death can come suddenly and without warning. But even in the midst of this violence, Carlo maintains his characteristic discretion. While other gangsters accumulate reputations for deadly efficiency, Carlo focuses on intelligence gathering and strategic planning. He becomes one of Maranzano's most trusted advisors, not because he is the most violent, but because he is the most thoughtful. His ability to analyze complex situations and predict likely outcomes makes him invaluable during a period when poor decisions can literally be fatal. The war reaches its climax in April 1931 when Joe Masseria is assassinated during a lunch meeting in a Coney Island restaurant. The killing is orchestrated by Lucky Luciano, Masseria's supposed lieutenant, who has secretly negotiated his boss's elimination with Maranzano's faction. Carlo is not directly involved in the assassination, but he is part of the planning process, contributing his expertise in logistics and his understanding of how to minimize the risk of law enforcement interference. With Masseria's death, Salvatore Maranzano emerges as the victor and proclaims himself boss of bosses over all Italian-American crime families in the United States. He organizes a grand meeting at which he outlines his vision for a national crime syndicate structured like a military organization with himself as supreme commander and various family leaders serving as his generals. Carlo attends this meeting as a representative of the Mangano family, but he is deeply skeptical of Maranzano's grandiose plans. His years of observation have taught him that successful criminal organizations, like successful businesses, must be flexible and adaptive rather than rigidly hierarchical. Maranzano's Roman legions may have worked in the ancient world, but Carlo doubts they are suited to the fast-changing environment of American crime. More importantly, Carlo recognizes that Maranzano has made the same mistake that destroyed Joe Masseria. He has become too visible, too ambitious, too eager to centralize power in his own hands. The new boss of bosses is attracting exactly the kind of attention from law enforcement and the press that Carlo has spent his entire career avoiding. Carlo's skepticism proves prophetic. Within months of his victory, Maranzano begins to be seen as a threat by the very men who helped him defeat Masseria. Lucky Luciano in particular recognizes that Maranzano's dictatorial ambitions will eventually bring disaster to everyone involved. Once again a conspiracy forms, and once again Carlo finds himself in a position to influence the outcome. But this time, Carlo's role is even more crucial. As one of the few gangsters who commands respect from members of different families, he serves as an intermediary in the delicate negotiations that precede Maranzano's elimination. His reputation for discretion and fair dealing makes him the perfect messenger for communications that could mean life or death for everyone involved. In September 1931, Salvatore Maranzano is assassinated in his Manhattan office by gunmen posing as federal agents. The killing is swift, professional, and decisive. With Maranzano's death, the Castellammarese War finally ends, but more importantly, the old era of Italian-American crime ends with it. What emerges from the ashes of the war is something unprecedented in the history of organized crime. A truly modern criminal syndicate based on cooperation rather than domination, flexibility rather than rigid hierarchy, and intelligence rather than brute force. Lucky Luciano becomes the acknowledged leader of this new arrangement, but power is shared among a council of family leaders who maintain autonomy over their own territories while cooperating on matters of mutual interest. Carlo Gambino's role in creating this new order cannot be overstated. His diplomatic skills, strategic intelligence, and reputation for reliability make him indispensable during the delicate process of negotiating the new arrangements. When the dust settles, the Mangano family finds itself in a stronger position than ever before, and Carlo has emerged as Vincent Mangano's most trusted advisor and likely successor. But perhaps most importantly, Carlo has established himself as a power broker who transcends the boundaries of any single family. His relationships with leaders from other organizations, his understanding of both criminal operations and legitimate business, and his proven ability to navigate complex political situations make him a valuable ally and a dangerous enemy. As the 1930s progress in America begins its slow recovery from the Great Depression, Carlo Gambino stands ready to help lead organized crime into its golden age. The wars of succession are over. The old crude methods of the previous generation have been discarded in favor of more sophisticated approaches. And at the center of it all, quiet and patient as always, stands the small Sicilian who has transformed himself into one of the most powerful and respected figures in American crime. The boy who once herded sheep in the hills of Palermo has become a shepherd of a different kind, guiding his organization and his allies through the treacherous landscape of American opportunity. But this is only the beginning. The greatest achievements of Carlo Gambino still lie ahead, waiting to unfold in the shadows of the American dream. We've traveled far tonight, haven't we? From the dusty streets of Sicily to the smoke-filled back rooms of Brooklyn, following the quiet footsteps of a man who understood that true power whispers rather than shouts. Carlo Gambino has survived his first great test in America, emerging from the chaos of the Castellammarese War not just intact, but stronger than before. But our journey through the shadows has only just begun. We're about to witness how a careful, patient man builds an empire that will endure for decades, touching every corner of American life while remaining almost invisible to the public eye. If you're finding peace in this story tonight, if these quiet tales of strategy and survival are helping you drift toward rest, I'd be grateful if you'd take a moment to let me know. A gentle tap on the like button tells me that these long-form stories resonate with fellow night travelers like yourself. And if you haven't already, consider subscribing to join our community of insomniacs and dream seekers who find comfort in the complex tales of history's most fascinating figures. Your comments mean the world to me. Earlier I asked where you're watching from tonight, and I love seeing the responses flow in from around the globe. Whether you're in a cozy bedroom in Minnesota or watching the sunrise from a balcony in Tokyo, you're part of this journey. Your presence here makes this story complete. Now let us continue deeper into the life of Carlo Gambino. We're about to explore how a man seizes opportunity when it presents itself, how patience and preparation meet in a moment that changes everything. The stage is set for one of the most dramatic transitions of power in the history of American organized crime. Rest easy and let the story carry you forward through the night. The 1950s arrive in America like a promise of prosperity and progress. Suburban communities bloom across the landscape like flowers in spring. Television antennas sprout from rooftops, connecting families to a shared vision of American life that is clean, safe, and optimistic. But beneath this surface of domestic tranquility, in the shadowy quarters where legitimate society prefers not to look, older and more complex dramas continue to unfold. By 1950, Carlo Gambino has spent nearly 3 decades building his reputation as one of the most intelligent and reliable figures in organized crime. He is now a senior member of the Mangano crime family, serving as underboss to Vincent Mangano and working closely with Albert Anastasia, the family's feared enforcer, who has earned the nickname Lord High Executioner for his willingness to solve problems through violence. But the relationship between Vincent Mangano and Albert Anastasia has grown increasingly strained over the years. Mangano, a man of the old school who believes in maintaining low profiles and avoiding unnecessary attention, disapproves of Anastasia's brutal methods and his tendency to attract newspaper headlines. Anastasia, ambitious and impatient, chafes under what he sees as Mangano's overly cautious leadership and his resistance to expanding the family's operations. Carlo Gambino watches this growing tension with his characteristic patience and analytical intelligence. He understands that the conflict between Mangano and Anastasia is more than a simple personality clash. It represents a fundamental disagreement about the future direction of organized crime in America. The question is whether criminal organizations should maintain the traditional Sicilian emphasis on indices, discretion and restraint, or embrace a more aggressive American style approach that prioritizes expansion and profit over caution and tradition. As the tension escalates, Carlo finds himself in an increasingly difficult position. His loyalty to Vincent Mangano runs deep, based on years of mutual respect and shared values. At the same time, he recognizes that Albert Anastasia commands the support of many younger family members who are eager for more opportunities and less concerned about maintaining traditional boundaries. The crisis comes to a head in April 1951, when Vincent Mangano disappears without a trace. His brother Philip Mangano is found shot to death, but Vincent simply vanishes, leaving behind only speculation and rumors. Albert Anastasia claims that Vincent was killed by enemies from another family, but most knowledgeable observers suspect that Anastasia himself orchestrated the elimination of his former boss. With Vincent Mangano gone, Albert Anastasia moves quickly to consolidate his control over the family. He calls a meeting of all senior members and announces that he is assuming leadership, citing both his seniority and the need for strong leadership during a period of crisis. The meeting is tense, with some members clearly uncomfortable with the circumstances surrounding Mangano's disappearance, but no one is prepared to challenge Anastasia directly. Carlo Gambino faces the most crucial decision of his career. He can oppose Anastasia's assumption of power, which would likely mean death or exile, or he can accept the new leadership and work within the new structure to protect his own interests and those of his allies. For a man who has built his reputation on loyalty and honor, the choice is agonizing. But Carlo is also a realist who understands that in the world of organized crime, as in the world of legitimate business, successful adaptation requires the ability to adjust to changing circumstances while maintaining core principles. He decides to accept Anastasia's leadership publicly, while privately maintaining his reservations about the new boss's methods and judgment. This decision proves to be strategically brilliant. By avoiding a confrontation he cannot win, Carlo preserves his position within the family and maintains his ability to influence events from within. More importantly, he begins to build relationships with other family members who share his concerns about Anastasia's leadership style, creating a network of allies who trust his judgment and respect his discretion. Under Albert Anastasia's leadership, the family enters a period of rapid expansion and increasing visibility that makes Carlo deeply uncomfortable. Anastasia pushes the organization into new areas of criminal activity, including labor racketeering, drug trafficking, and increasingly sophisticated gambling operations. The profits are substantial, but so are the risks. Anastasia's most controversial venture is his involvement in what the press calls Murder, Inc., a criminal organization that provides assassination services to other crime families. While the service is profitable and helps maintain Anastasia's reputation as a man to be feared, it also attracts exactly the kind of law enforcement attention that Carlo believes is ultimately self-destructive. Throughout the 1950s, Carlo works to build his own power base within the family, while maintaining the appearance of complete loyalty to Anastasia. He focuses on developing the organization's interests in legitimate businesses, understanding that the future of organized crime lies not in traumatic criminal enterprises, but in the quiet corruption of legal institutions and the subtle manipulation of economic systems. Carlo's approach proves prescient as law enforcement pressure on organized crime intensifies throughout the decade. The Federal Bureau of Investigation, under the leadership of J. Edgar Hoover, begins to take organized crime more seriously as a national security threat. Congressional hearings led by Senator Estes Kefauver shine unwelcome spotlight on criminal organizations. forcing many prominent gangsters to testify in public about their activities. Albert Anastasia's violent reputation and high profile make him a particular target of law enforcement attention. Unlike Carlo, who has managed to avoid any significant criminal charges throughout his career, Anastasia faces constant scrutiny and repeated legal challenges. This pressure affects his judgment and makes him increasingly paranoid and unpredictable. The situation reaches a breaking point in 1957 when Anastasia's erratic behavior and poor decision-making begin to threaten not just his own position, but the stability of the entire organization. His involvement in various high-profile criminal activities has attracted so much law enforcement attention that other crime families begin to see him as a liability rather than an asset. Carlo recognizes that change is inevitable, but he also understands that the transition must be handled carefully, too. Avoid the kind of internal warfare that could destroy the family entirely. He begins to cultivate relationships with leaders from other families, particularly Vito Genovese, who has his own reasons for wanting to see Anastasia removed from power. The conspiracy that develops is a masterpiece of criminal planning, involving multiple families and requiring precise coordination to avoid detection by both law enforcement and Anastasia's own security apparatus. Carlo's role is crucial, but characteristically subtle. He provides intelligence about Anastasia's routines in security arrangements while maintaining complete deniability about his involvement in any plot. On October 25, 1957, Albert Anastasia is assassinated while receiving a haircut at the Park Sheridan Hotel barbershop in Manhattan. The killing is swift and professional, carried out by gunmen who disappear immediately afterward and are never identified or captured. The murder sends shockwaves through both the criminal underworld and law enforcement, marking the end of one of the most violent and feared crime bosses in American history. With Anastasia's death, Carlo Gambino emerges as the natural successor to leadership of what will now become known as the Gambino crime family. His assumption of power is remarkably smooth, aided by the respect he has built over decades of careful relationship building and strategic thinking. Unlike the violent transitions that marked earlier changes in leadership, Carlo's rise to the top is accomplished through consensus and mutual agreement, rather than force and intimidation. At the age of 55, Carlo Gambino has finally achieved the position that his intelligence and patience have been preparing him for throughout his adult life. He is now the head of what will become the most powerful and enduring crime family in American history. But his methods of leadership will be as different from Albert Anastasia's as night from day. Where Anastasia ruled through fear, Carlo will govern through respect. Where Anastasia sought publicity and notoriety, Carlo will prize invisibility and discretion. Where Anastasia made enemies through arrogance and violence, Carlo will build alliances through diplomacy and mutual benefit. The quiet shepherd from Sicily has become the shepherd of shepherds, and his flock is about to grow in ways that will astonish even his most ambitious dreams. The late 1950s find Carlo Gambino standing at the summit of a criminal empire. But if you passed him on the street, you would never suspect his true position in the shadow hierarchy of American power. He dresses modestly, drives ordinary cars, and lives in a comfortable but unremarkable house in Brooklyn. To his neighbors, he appears to be nothing more than a successful small businessman, perhaps involved in construction or waste management, the kind of second-generation immigrant who has achieved the American dream through hard work and careful saving. But appearances, as Carlo has always understood, can be the most powerful weapons in a wise man's arsenal. His deliberate cultivation of ordinariness serves multiple purposes. It allows him to move freely through both criminal and legitimate society without attracting attention. It makes him less attractive as a target for ambitious rivals. And it provides perfect cover for building the kind of sophisticated criminal organization that previous generations of gangsters could never have imagined. Carlo's approach to leadership represents a revolutionary departure from the traditional methods of American organized crime, where previous bosses ruled through intimidation and maintained power through the constant threat of violence. Carlo builds his authority on competence, reliability, and the ability to generate prosperity for all those under his protection. He understands that fear may compel obedience, but only respect and mutual benefit can create the kind of loyalty that endures through generations. His first priority as the new head of the family is to restructure the organization along more efficient and sustainable lines. The old model, inherited from Sicily and adapted to American conditions by earlier generations, relied heavily on personal relationships and informal agreements that could be disrupted by personality conflicts or changing circumstances. Carlo envisions something more systematic, a criminal corporation that can survive changes in leadership, adapt to evolving market conditions, and operate profitably for decades without destroying itself through internal warfare. To achieve this vision, Carlo begins by establishing clear lines of authority and responsibility within the family structure. Unlike Albert Anastasia, who made most decisions personally and kept his subordinates in the dark about broader strategic planning, Carlo creates a more collaborative leadership model that allows trusted lieutenants to exercise real authority within their areas of expertise while maintaining overall coordination and discipline. His underboss, Neil Delacroix, handles day-to-day operational matters and serves as the primary interface with lower-level family members. Delacroix is a man of the old school, respected for his toughness and feared for his willingness to use violence when necessary, but also intelligent enough to understand that Carlo's more sophisticated approach offers better long-term prospects than the crude methods of the past. Carlo's consigliere or advisor is Joseph Riccobono, a thoughtful man whose primary responsibility is to mediate disputes within the family and provide counsel on strategic matters that require careful consideration. Riccobono's role is crucial because it allows Carlo to maintain some distance from controversial decisions while ensuring that all major issues receive thorough analysis before action is taken. But the real genius of Carlo's organizational structure lies in his creation of multiple semi-autonomous crews, each headed by a capo who reports directly to the underboss, but maintains considerable latitude in managing his own operations. This decentralized approach serves several purposes. It makes the organization more resilient to law enforcement pressure by ensuring that the capture or elimination of any single leader cannot paralyze the entire structure. It allows for specialization and expertise development within different areas of criminal activity, and it creates multiple profit centers that can adapt to changing market conditions without requiring constant oversight from the top. Each crew operates like a small business within the larger criminal corporation, responsible for identifying opportunities, managing risks, and generating profits that are shared with the overall organization through a traditional percentage system. But unlike earlier crime families, where crew leaders often operated with minimal supervision and frequently came into conflict with each other over territorial disputes, Carlo's crews are bound together by sophisticated coordination mechanisms that prevent destructive competition while encouraging innovation and growth. Carlo's genius for organization extends beyond the internal structure of the family to encompass its relationships with the broader criminal and legitimate communities. He recognizes that no criminal organization, no matter how powerful, can operate successfully in isolation from the larger society in which it exists. Success requires the cultivation of mutually beneficial relationships with politicians, judges, police officials, business leaders, union organizers, and countless other figures who can provide information, influence, and protection in exchange for various forms of assistance. But where earlier crime bosses often relied on crude bribery and intimidation to secure cooperation from public officials, Carlo develops more sophisticated methods of influence that are harder to detect and prosecute. Instead of offering cash payments that can be traced and used as evidence, he creates opportunities for legitimate profit sharing, provides valuable services that solve real problems for his allies, and builds personal relationships based on genuine mutual respect and shared interests. A politician facing a difficult re-election campaign might find that Carlo's organization can provide not just financial support, but also valuable intelligence about his opponent's vulnerabilities and strategies. A judge struggling with gambling debts might discover that his problems disappear without any apparent connection to any criminal organization. A police captain dealing with a particularly troublesome criminal who operates outside organized crime's influence might learn that the problem has been solved through channels that leave no official fingerprints. This approach to relationship building requires enormous patience and sophisticated understanding of human psychology, but it creates a network of influence that is far more durable and effective than the crude corruption practiced by earlier generations. Carlo's allies remain loyal not because they fear him, but because their association with him genuinely improves their lives and advances their legitimate interests. The same sophisticated approach characterizes Carlo's expansion of the family's criminal enterprises. Rather than simply taking over existing illegal operations through force or intimidation, he focuses on identifying inefficiencies and unmet needs in both criminal and legitimate markets, then developing innovative solutions that generate profits while minimizing risks. His gambling operations, for example, go far beyond the traditional numbers running and bookmaking that formed the backbone of earlier organized crime. Carlo recognizes that Americans' appetite for gambling is enormous and largely unsatisfied by the limited legal options available in most jurisdictions. His organization begins to offer sophisticated gambling services that cater to different market segments, from high-stakes poker games for wealthy businessmen to numbers running in working-class neighborhoods. But the real innovation lies in how these operations are structured and protected. Rather than operating obvious gambling establishments that attract law enforcement attention, Carlo's people create seemingly legitimate businesses that provide gambling opportunities as a secondary service. Social clubs offer card games for their members. Restaurants host private parties where high-stakes gambling occurs in back rooms. Construction companies run numbers games among their workers as an employee benefit. This approach makes law enforcement's job enormously more difficult, because it requires them to prove not just that gambling is occurring, but that it is the primary purpose of businesses that appear to have legitimate reasons for existing. At the same time, it allows Carlo's organization to provide genuine value to customers who might otherwise be forced to deal with less reliable and more dangerous criminal operators. The same principles apply to Carlo's expansion into labor racketeering, one of the most profitable areas of organized crime during the post-war economic boom. Rather than simply extorting money from unions and employers through threats of violence, Carlo's people position themselves as problem solvers who can help both sides achieve their legitimate objectives while skimming profits from the increased efficiency they create. When unions and management find themselves deadlocked in negotiations that threaten to shut down construction projects or shipping operations, Carlo's representatives can provide unofficial mediation services that break the deadlocks and get people back to work. When employers face problems with employee theft or industrial sabotage, Carlo's organization can provide security services that are far more effective than anything available through legitimate channels. When union leaders need to demonstrate their effectiveness to membership, Carlo's people can help orchestrate contract settlements that provide real benefits to workers while maintaining profitability for employers. This approach to labor racketeering transforms what had traditionally been a zero-sum game of extortion and intimidation into a positive sum arrangement where all parties benefit from their association with organized crime. Workers get better contracts and more job security. Employers get more reliable labor relations and protection against various forms of disruption. Union leaders get enhanced reputations for effectiveness. And Carlo's organization receives a steady stream of income that is less vulnerable to law enforcement pressure because it is based on genuine value creation rather than simple extortion. By the early 1960s, the transformation of the Gambino crime family under Carlo's leadership is evident to anyone with eyes to see. The organization has grown in both size and sophistication, expanding from a traditional Sicilian American crime family into something resembling a modern criminal corporation with interests spanning multiple industries and geographic regions. More importantly, the family has achieved a level of stability and legitimacy that earlier crime bosses could never have imagined. While other criminal organizations continue to attract newspaper headlines and law enforcement attention through their involvement in dramatic crimes and violent disputes, Carlo's family operates so quietly and effectively that most people are unaware of its existence, let alone its enormous influence over various aspects of American economic and political life. Carlo Gambino has proven that a patient man with intelligence and vision can accomplish more through strategic thinking and careful relationship building than other men achieve through violence and intimidation. The quiet shepherd from Sicily has built an empire that rivals any legitimate corporation in its scope and effectiveness. And he has done it all while maintaining the modest demeanor and unremarkable appearance that first served him when he arrived as an unknown immigrant nearly 40 years earlier. Even as Carlo enjoys the fruits of his strategic brilliance, he understands that success in the criminal world, like success in any competitive environment, requires constant vigilance and continuous adaptation. New challenges are always emerging. New opportunities are always presenting themselves, and new rivals are always plotting to take what others have built through superior intelligence and effort. The 1960s dawn across America like a curtain rising on a grand stage, revealing a nation transformed by prosperity, technology, and boundless optimism about the future. But behind this bright facade of progress, in the quiet quarters where real power congregates and true decisions are made, Carlo Gambino is weaving a web of influence, so subtle and pervasive that even those caught within it rarely understand the full extent of their entanglement. Picture, if you will, a typical morning in Carlo's modest Brooklyn home in 1965. He rises early, as has been his habit since childhood, and begins each day with the same quiet ritual: coffee prepared by his wife Catherine, a careful reading of multiple newspapers, and a series of brief telephone conversations conducted in the mixture of Sicilian dialect and careful English that serves as his organization's private language. To an outside observer, these morning calls might seem like the routine business of a small construction company owner or waste management contractor. But each conversation is actually a carefully orchestrated exchange of information that helps Carlo maintain his understanding of an empire that now spans multiple industries, crosses state boundaries, and touches virtually every aspect of New York's economic and political life. The first call might come from the waterfront, where longshoremen under Carlo's influence control the loading and unloading of ships that carry goods worth millions of dollars. The conversation is brief and seemingly mundane, a discussion of work schedules, weather conditions, and minor personnel matters. But encoded within this ordinary exchange is intelligence about law enforcement surveillance, updates on labor negotiations that could affect court operations, and information about valuable cargo that might be available for redistribution through unofficial channels. The second call originates from a construction site in Manhattan, where Carlo's people have established relationships with both union leaders and management, representatives that allow them to influence everything, from bidding processes to work assignments. Again, the conversation appears routine: discussion of material deliveries, permit approvals, and safety inspections. But the real substance involves the coordination of activities that ensure Carlo's organization receives its appropriate share of profits from construction projects throughout the metropolitan area. The third call comes from a restaurant in Little Italy where the owner serves not just authentic Sicilian cuisine, but also acts as an intermediary between Carlo's organization and various legitimate businesses that benefit from unofficial protection services. The conversation focuses on ordinary restaurant concerns, food deliveries, staff scheduling, upcoming private parties. But between the lines runs information about business owners who need assistance with various problems, political figures who require discreet support, and opportunities for expansion into new areas of mutual benefit. Each of these conversations lasts only a few minutes and contains nothing that would interest law enforcement officials, even if they were listening. But together, they provide Carlo with a comprehensive understanding of his organization's activities and allow him to coordinate responses to challenges and opportunities across multiple areas of operation. This daily intelligence gathering ritual reflects Carlo's understanding that effective leadership requires not just the ability to make good decisions, but also the ability to gather accurate information upon which good decisions can be based. Unlike earlier crime bosses who relied primarily on personal observation and face-to-face meetings, Carlo has created a sophisticated information network that provides him with real-time intelligence about everything from law enforcement activities to market conditions in industries where his organization maintains interests. The scope of these interests would astonish anyone who imagines organized crime as consisting primarily of dramatic activities like robbery, extortion, and murder. By the mid-1960s, Carlo's organization has financial stakes in dozens of legitimate businesses, unofficial but profitable relationships with hundreds of others, and various forms of influence over labor unions that represent tens of thousands of workers. The construction industry represents one of Carlo's most sophisticated and profitable areas of operation. New York in the 1960s is experiencing a building boom that creates enormous opportunities for those positioned to take advantage of them. Office towers, residential developments, highways, bridges, and public facilities are under construction throughout the metropolitan area, generating billions of dollars in economic activity and thousands of jobs for skilled workers. Carlo's organization has positioned itself at multiple strategic points within this industry's complex ecosystem. Through relationships with labor unions, his people can influence which workers get hired for various projects and how efficiently those projects are completed. Through connections with suppliers, they can affect the cost and availability of materials needed for construction. Through ties with political figures, they can influence the permit and inspection processes that determine whether projects can proceed on schedule or face costly delays. But the real genius of Carlo's approach lies in how these various forms of influence work together to create value for everyone involved while generating profits for his organization. Rather than simply extracting money through threats and intimidation, Carlo's people position themselves as problem solvers who can help construction projects run more smoothly and profitably than would otherwise be possible. When a major construction project faces potential delays due to labor disputes, Carlo's representatives can provide unofficial mediation services that break deadlocks and get work back on schedule. When material shipments are threatened by dock strikes or trucking problems, his organization can ensure that critical supplies reach job sites through alternative channels. When permit approvals are delayed by bureaucratic inefficiency or political complications, his contacts within government agencies can expedite processes that might otherwise take months to complete. These services provide genuine value to construction companies, developers, and property owners who benefit from having their projects completed on time and within budget. At the same time, they generate substantial income for Carlo's organization through various forms of compensation that are difficult for law enforcement to detect or prove in court. The waterfront presents similar opportunities for sophisticated criminal entrepreneurship. The Port of New York handles millions of tons of cargo every year, making it one of the busiest commercial centers in the world. This enormous volume of activity creates countless opportunities for those who understand how to operate in the gray areas between completely legal and obviously illegal behavior. Carlo's people have established relationships throughout the port's complex hierarchy. From individual longshoremen who actually load and unload ships to union officials, who control work assignments, to shipping company executives, who make decisions about routes and schedules. These relationships allow the organization to provide various services that benefit all parties involved while generating profits that never appear on any official records. Valuable cargo that might otherwise be lost to theft by unorganized criminals receives protection through Carlo's unofficial security services. Shipping schedules that might be disrupted by labor disputes or bureaucratic delays are maintained through his organization's problem-solving capabilities. Import and export processes that might be complicated by regulatory requirements are expedited through his connections with customs officials and port authorities. Once again, Carlo's approach transforms what might otherwise be simple extortion into a complex system of mutual benefit that creates genuine value while generating substantial profits. Shipping companies save money through reduced losses and more efficient operations. Workers benefit from steadier employment and better working conditions. And Carlo's organization receives compensation that reflects the real economic value of the services it provides. The gambling operations overseen by Carlo's family represent perhaps the most sophisticated example of his approach to criminal entrepreneurship. Rather than operating obvious casinos or betting parlors that would attract immediate law enforcement attention, his organization has created an integrated network of gambling opportunities that serves different market segments while maintaining complete plausible deniability about the true nature of the services being provided. High-stakes poker games take place in private clubs that appear to be exclusive social organizations for successful businessmen. Sports betting is facilitated through seemingly legitimate businesses that provide other services to their customers. Numbers Running operates through networks of small retailers who handle gambling transactions as a minor sideline to their primary commercial activities. But the real sophistication lies in how these various operations are coordinated and protected, rather than relying on violence or intimidation to maintain discipline and collect debts. Carlo's organization has created financial and social incentives that encourage responsible participation and self-regulation among participants. Regular customers who honor their commitments receive access to more exclusive games and better odds on various bets. Business owners who facilitate gambling activities receive various forms of assistance with their legitimate operations, from help with supplier relationships to protection against troublesome competitors. Even law enforcement officials who show appropriate flexibility in their interpretation of gambling laws find that their broader law enforcement responsibilities become easier through access to intelligence about truly dangerous criminals who operate outside organized crime's disciplinary influence. This approach to gambling operations creates a stable and profitable business model that serves customers' genuine interests while minimizing the risks that destroyed earlier criminal enterprises. Participants feel that they are receiving fair treatment and good value for their money. Business owners who provide facilities or services feel adequately compensated for any risks they assume. Even law enforcement officials can point to genuine public safety benefits that result from having gambling activities controlled by disciplined organizations rather than unregulated criminal entrepreneurs. By the late 1960s, Carlo Gambino's transformation of organized crime has created something unprecedented in American criminal history. a criminal organization that operates more like a legitimate business than a traditional gang, providing genuine services to willing customers while maintaining sufficient discipline and discretion to avoid the attention that destroyed earlier criminal enterprises. In the hushed corridors of power, where America's most dangerous men gathered to conduct their shadow business, there exists a peculiar form of honor among thieves. It is here, in the carefully orchestrated meetings between crime family leaders, that Carlo Gambino's genius for diplomacy and strategic thinking shines brightest, transforming him from merely the head of a powerful organization into something approaching a criminal statesman. The Commission, as it came to be known, represents perhaps the most sophisticated attempt at criminal self-governance in human history. Established in the aftermath of the Castellammarese War, it serves as a combination Supreme Court, trade association, and diplomatic council for America's major Italian-American crime families. Its purpose is simple in concept, but enormously complex in execution: to prevent the kind of intrafamily warfare that periodically destroys criminal organizations, while creating mechanisms for cooperation that benefit all participants. Carlo's role within this shadowy Congress evolves gradually, but inevitably toward leadership. His reputation for fairness, intelligence, and discretion makes him a natural mediator when disputes arise between families. His understanding of both criminal operations and legitimate business makes him invaluable when the Commission must address questions that require sophisticated analysis of market, conditions, and regulatory environments. Most importantly, his ability to see long-term strategic implications of short-term decisions makes him indispensable when the organization faces challenges that threaten the stability of organized crime as a whole. Picture a typical Commission meeting in the late 1960s, held perhaps in the back room of a restaurant that has been closed to the public for a private party, or in the conference room of a legitimate business that provides perfect cover for what appears to be an ordinary corporate board meeting. The men who gather around the polished wooden table represent billions of dollars in criminal enterprises and wield influence that extends into every corner of American society. There is Carlo himself, now recognized as the most powerful and respected member of the Commission, sitting quietly with his hands folded, listening intently as each speaker presents his perspective on the matter at hand. His physical appearance remains as unremarkable as ever. A small elderly man in a conservative suit, who might be mistaken for a neighborhood shopkeeper. But everyone in the room understands that behind those patient eyes lies one of the most formidable criminal intelligences in the world. To his right sits Vito Genovese, until recently Carlo's greatest rival for supremacy within the Commission, now serving a federal prison sentence, but still attempting to maintain control over his organization through intermediaries and messengers. Genovese represents the old school of criminal leadership, brutal, paranoid, and ultimately self-destructive. His downfall serves as an object lesson in the dangers of allowing personal ambition to override strategic thinking. Across the table is Frank Costello, the elder statesman of American organized crime, a man whose career spans from the rough-and-tumble days of prohibition to the sophisticated criminal enterprises of the modern era. Costello's relationships with political figures and legitimate businessmen are legendary, but his advancing age and desire to minimize his exposure to law enforcement have reduced his active role in Commission deliberations. The other seats are occupied by representatives of families from Philadelphia, Buffalo, Chicago, and other major cities, each bringing their own perspectives and interests to the discussions. But increasingly, when difficult decisions must be made or complex problems must be solved, the other Commission members look to Carlo for guidance. The matters discussed in these meetings reveal the extraordinary scope and sophistication of organized crime in America during its golden age. Territorial disputes that might once have led to warfare are now resolved through careful negotiation and compromise. Business opportunities that require cooperation between families are evaluated and coordinated. Responses to law enforcement pressure are planned and implemented with the kind of strategic coordination that would impress any military organization. But perhaps most importantly, the Commission serves as a forum for establishing and maintaining the unwritten rules that govern criminal behavior and prevent the kind of excesses that attract unwanted attention from law, enforcement, and the press. These rules, codified through decades of experience and refined through careful analysis of what works and what doesn't, represent a criminal code of conduct that is more sophisticated and more rigorously enforced than the legal systems of many nations. Under Carlo's influence, the Commission develops increasingly sophisticated policies regarding the use of violence. While earlier generations of criminals resorted to killing as a first response to problems, Carlo advocates for violence only as a last resort and only when it can be applied with surgical precision to solve specific problems without creating larger difficulties. When violence is deemed necessary, it must be authorized by appropriate leadership and carried out by professionals who understand the importance of discretion and efficiency. Random violence, public killings, and attacks on civilians or law enforcement officers are strictly forbidden because they attract the kind of attention that threatens everyone's operations. Even violence against other criminals must be justified by serious violations of accepted norms and must be carried out in ways that send appropriate messages without creating murders or triggering cycles of retaliation. The Commission also establishes sophisticated guidelines for criminal enterprises that help member organizations maximize profits while minimizing risks. Drug trafficking, for example, is initially banned entirely because Commission members understand that the enormous profits involved create temptations that can destroy the discipline essential to successful criminal organizations. When the ban proves impossible to maintain due to pressure from younger family members who see the enormous profits being made by independent operators, the Commission establishes strict rules designed to limit participation to the most disciplined and trustworthy members. Similarly, the Commission creates detailed protocols for interactions with law enforcement officials. Bribery is acceptable and even encouraged when it serves legitimate organizational purposes, but it must be handled with extreme discretion and should focus on developing long-term relationships rather than solving immediate problems. Violence against law enforcement officers is absolutely forbidden except in cases of immediate self-defense, because killing police officers or federal agents inevitably leads to the kind of massive retaliation that can destroy entire organizations. These policies reflect Carlo's understanding that successful criminal organizations, like successful legitimate businesses, must operate according to sustainable principles rather than simply pursuing short-term profits. His influence within the Commission helps transform American organized crime from a collection of competing gangs into something resembling a mature industry with established norms, professional standards, and sophisticated mechanisms for self-regulation. Carlo's relationships with other Commission members illustrate his genius for building alliances based on mutual respect and shared interests rather than fear and intimidation. His friendship with Frank Costello, for example, is based on their common understanding that the future of organized crime lies in sophisticated corruption of legitimate institutions rather than dramatic criminal enterprises that attract newspaper headlines. Their conversations, conducted during long walks through Brooklyn neighborhoods or quiet dinners in family restaurants, range across topics that would fascinate any student of American power structures. They discuss the changing nature of political corruption as professional campaign. Organizations replace old-fashioned political machines. They analyze the implications of new federal legislation that creates opportunities for organized crime in some areas while increasing risks in others. They evaluate the potential of emerging technologies to create new criminal opportunities or new law enforcement capabilities. These discussions reveal Carlo's extraordinary intellectual curiosity and his understanding that criminal leadership requires the same kind of sophisticated analysis of changing social and economic conditions that characterizes successful leadership in any field. He reads voraciously, not just newspapers and trade publications, but academic studies, government reports, and business analyses that help him understand the larger trends that will affect his organization's future operations. His relationship with Sam Giancana, the flamboyant head of the Chicago family, provides a study in contrasts that illuminates Carlo's approach to criminal leadership. Where Giancana courts publicity and enjoys his reputation as a dangerous and glamorous figure, Carlo cultivates anonymity and prizes his ability to move through society without attracting attention. Where Giancana makes decisions impulsively based on immediate emotions, Carlo deliberates carefully and considers long-term implications of every major choice. The contrast between their approaches becomes particularly evident during the early 1960s, when both men face pressure from the Kennedy administration's unprecedented assault on organized crime. Giancana responds with public defiance and private rage, making statements to the press and pursuing vendettas that ultimately contribute to his downfall. Carlo responds with characteristic patience and strategic thinking, quietly adjusting his operations to minimize exposure while maintaining profitability and discipline within his organization. By the mid-1960s, Carlo's reputation within the Commission has evolved to the point where he is widely regarded as the boss of bosses, though he never claims this title publicly and carefully avoids any actions that might suggest he is attempting to dominate other families. Instead, he functions as first among equals, providing guidance and coordination when requested, while respecting the autonomy and traditional prerogatives of other organizations. This delicate balance reflects Carlo's understanding that lasting power in any complex system requires the consent of those being governed, rather than simply their fear or submission. By serving the interests of other commission members, rather than exploiting them, Carlo creates relationships that are more durable and ultimately more profitable than those based purely on dominance and intimidation. The wisdom of this approach becomes evident as other criminal leaders who attempt to rule through force and intimidation find themselves facing rebellion, betrayal, and ultimate destruction. Carlo's gentler methods prove not only more humane, but also more effective, creating an empire that will outlast his own life and continue to flourish long after more dramatic and violent leaders have been forgotten. As the 1960s progress toward their turbulent conclusion, Carlo Gambino stands at the apex of American organized crime, respected by allies and enemies alike as a master strategist whose understanding of power and human nature has enabled him to build something unprecedented in criminal history. A lasting criminal dynasty based not on fear, but on competence. Not on violence, but on value creation. Not on domination, but on cooperation and mutual benefit. The quiet shepherd from Sicily has become the shepherd of shepherds, and his flock continues to grow in the shadows of the American dream. November 14th, 1957 dawns gray and cold in the rural hills of upstate New York, where the trees have shed their autumn leaves and winter's approach whispers through bare branches. In the small town of Apalachin, population barely over 1,000, local residents go about their ordinary business, unaware that their quiet community is about to become the setting for one of the most significant disasters in the history of American organized crime. Joseph Barbara Sr., a local businessman who owns a beverage distributorship and maintains a comfortable estate in the countryside outside town, is preparing to host what he believes will be a routine gathering of friends and business associates. To his neighbors, Barbara appears to be exactly what he claims to be, a successful entrepreneur who has achieved the American dream through hard work and smart investing. They have no reason to suspect that his modest estate is about to become ground zero for an event that will reshape law enforcement's understanding of organized crime in America. The meeting at Barbara's estate has been called to address several pressing issues facing the leadership of America's major crime families. The recent assassination of Albert Anastasia has created uncertainty about territorial boundaries and power relationships that require careful negotiation to prevent the kind of warfare that periodically destroys criminal organizations from within. At the same time, increasing pressure from federal law enforcement agencies requires coordination and strategic planning if the Xinji families are to maintain their operations without attracting the kind of attention that could lead to massive prosecutions. Carlo Gambino, now firmly established as head of what was once Albert Anastasia's family, travels to Apalachin with mixed feelings about the gathering. His instincts tell him that bringing together so many prominent criminal leaders in one location represents an unnecessary security risk, especially given the increasing sophistication of federal law enforcement surveillance capabilities. But his position as a relatively new family head and his respect for the Commission's collective decision-making process require his participation in this crucial meeting. The journey from Brooklyn to Appalachin takes several hours through the rolling countryside of upstate New York, and Carlo uses the time to reflect on the challenges facing organized crime in America. The old certainties that guided earlier generations of criminal leaders are rapidly disappearing, replaced by new realities that require constant adaptation and strategic thinking. Federal agencies are becoming more aggressive and more sophisticated in their investigations. Public attitudes toward organized crime are hardening as sensational media coverage creates demand for stronger law enforcement action. Most significantly, the insular Italian-American communities that traditionally provided protection and recruits for criminal organizations are assimilating into mainstream American society, weakening the cultural bonds that once made infiltration by law enforcement nearly impossible. These changes require organized crime to evolve or face extinction, but evolution is never easy for organizations built around tradition and established hierarchies. The Appalachin meeting represents an attempt to address these challenges through collective action, but Carlo worries that the very act of gathering so many leaders in one place may create more problems than it solves. His concerns prove prophetic, as approximately 100 men from crime families across the United States gather at Barbara's estate for what should have been a private and secure meeting. Local law enforcement officials become suspicious of the unusual amount of activity at the normally quiet residence. New York State Police Sergeant Edgar Crosswell, a dedicated investigator who has been monitoring organized crime activity in the area, decides to investigate the gathering. What happens next becomes one of the most embarrassing disasters in organized crime history. As law enforcement officials begin to close in on Barbara's estate, the meeting breaks up in chaos. Men who have spent their entire careers avoiding law enforcement attention find themselves running through the woods like common criminals, abandoning expensive cars and losing dignity along with their carefully cultivated anonymity. Carlo, despite his age and small stature, manages to escape the initial police dragnet, but the damage to organized crime's reputation for competence and invincibility is catastrophic. For the first time in American history, law enforcement officials have concrete proof that organized crime operates as a national conspiracy, involving dozens of families and hundreds of key figures. The carefully maintained fiction that these men are simply successful businessmen with no connection to criminal activity is destroyed in a single afternoon. More than 60 men are arrested or identified as participants in the meeting, and their names and photographs appear in newspapers across the country. Asterisk. Suddenly, figures who had operated in complete anonymity find themselves the subject of intense media attention and law enforcement scrutiny. The veil of secrecy that protected organized crime for decades is torn away, exposing the structure and leadership of criminal organizations to unprecedented public examination. For Carlo, who has built his entire career on discretion and anonymity, the Appalachian disaster represents both a personal humiliation and a strategic challenge of enormous proportions. His photograph appears in newspapers alongside other identified participants, ending forever his ability to move through legitimate society without being recognized as a major figure organized crime. The carefully constructed facade of respectability that allowed him to build relationships with political figures and business leaders is shattered, forcing him to adapt to a new reality in which his criminal associations are public knowledge. But even in the aftermath of this disaster, Carlo's strategic intelligence serves him well. While other crime leaders react with panic, anger, or despair, Carlo immediately begins to analyze the situation and develop strategies for minimizing the long-term damage. He understands that the Appalachian disaster, while embarrassing and problematic, does not necessarily spell the end of organized crime in America. What it does require is fundamental changes in how criminal organizations operate and how they relate to the larger society. Carlo's first priority is damage control within his own organization. He recognizes that the public exposure of organized crime leadership will inevitably lead to increased law enforcement pressure, informant recruitment efforts, and internal security challenges that require immediate attention. His response is characteristically thoughtful and systematic. Rather than simply increasing security measures and restricting information flow within the organization, Carlo begins a comprehensive review of all family operations to identify vulnerabilities that might be exploited by law enforcement agencies armed with new knowledge about organized crime structure and leadership. He orders the elimination of activities that are difficult to defend legally and the modification of operations that can be made less vulnerable to prosecution. At the same time, Carlo begins to restructure his organization's relationships with the legitimate world, recognizing that his public identification as a crime boss makes certain types of political and business relationships impossible to maintain. He develops new methods of influence that operate through intermediaries and legitimate front organizations rather than direct personal contact. This adaptation requires enormous sophistication and patience, but Carlo's decades of experience in building and maintaining complex networks serve him well. Instead of abandoning his connections to legitimate society, he simply creates additional layers of insulation that protect both his organization and his allies from the increased scrutiny that follows the Appalachin exposure. Perhaps most importantly, Carlo recognizes that the Appalachian disaster creates an opportunity as well as a challenge. The public exposure of organized crime leadership eliminates some of his competitors who are less capable of adapting to the new environment, while potentially clearing the field for those sophisticated enough to evolve with changing conditions. In the months and years following Apalachin, Carlo watches as several prominent crime leaders are destroyed by their inability to adjust to increased law enforcement pressure and public attention. Some, like Vito Genovese, are convicted on federal charges and sentenced to lengthy prison terms that effectively end their active criminal careers. Others find their organizations weakened by internal conflicts, as increased pressure creates suspicion and paranoia that destroy the trust essential to effective criminal cooperation. But Carlo's organization not only survives the post-Appalachin environment, but actually grows stronger as competitors fall by the wayside. His emphasis on discipline, discretion, and sustainable business practices proves ideally suited to an environment where law enforcement agencies have greatly enhanced capabilities for investigation and prosecution. The key to Carlo's successful adaptation lies in his understanding that the Appalachian disaster represents not just a law enforcement victory, but a fundamental shift in the relationship between organized crime and American society. The old model of criminal organizations operating in complete secrecy while maintaining extensive connections to political and business establishments is no longer viable. What replaces it must be more sophisticated, more disciplined, and more carefully structured to survive in an environment of enhanced scrutiny. Carlo's response involves several interconnected strategies that transform his organization without destroying its essential character or effectiveness. First, he implements what amounts to a comprehensive security review that identifies and eliminates practices that create unnecessary vulnerability to law enforcement. Investigation. Meetings that once took place in restaurants and social clubs are moved to more secure locations. Communications that once relied on telephone conversations and face-to-face discussions are restructured to minimize the risk of electronic surveillance. Record-keeping that once documented financial transactions is eliminated or coded in ways that make interpretation by outsiders extremely difficult. Second, Carlo begins a systematic process of legitimizing his organization's business interests. Wherever possible, operations that exist in legal gray areas are either eliminated or restructured to comply with applicable laws and regulations. Relationships with legitimate businesses are formalized through proper contracts and documentation that can withstand legal scrutiny. Investment strategies are developed that allow criminal profits to be converted into legitimate assets through complex but legal financial transactions. This legitimization process requires enormous patience and sophisticated understanding of business law, tax regulations, and corporate finance. But Carlo has been preparing for such challenges throughout his career. His relationships with accountants, lawyers, and business consultants who may not fully understand the source of his wealth but are willing to provide professional services in exchange for generous compensation allow him to navigate legal complexities that would defeat less sophisticated criminal leaders. Third, and perhaps most importantly, Carlo begins to restructure his organization's operational methods to reduce reliance on activities that are inherently vulnerable to law enforcement investigation. Traditional protection rackets that require obvious criminal behavior are gradually replaced by more sophisticated consulting and problem-solving services that provide genuine value to clients while generating substantial profits for the organization. Labor racketeering operations are refined to focus on legitimate union activities and genuine labor management mediation rather than simple extortion and intimidation. Gambling operations are restructured to minimize visibility while maximizing profitability through better understanding of customer preferences and market dynamics. Even loan sharking activities are modified to operate more like legitimate financial services, with proper documentation and reasonable interest rates that make prosecution more difficult while maintaining profitability. These changes require significant investment in training and education for family members, who must learn to operate in the new environment. Carlo establishes what amounts to a criminal management development program that teaches younger members sophisticated business skills, legal awareness, and security consciousness that previous generations of criminals never needed. The program reflects Carlo's understanding that the future of organized crime belongs to those who can function effectively in both criminal and legitimate environments, moving seamlessly between both worlds while maintaining the discipline and loyalty that make criminal organizations effective. This hybrid approach requires individuals who are educated, sophisticated, and emotionally mature enough to handle complex challenges without resorting to the crude violence that characterized earlier generations of criminal leadership. By the early 1960s, the transformation of Carlo's organization in response to the Apalachin disaster has created something unprecedented in American criminal history. A crime family that operates more like a legitimate corporation than a traditional gang, with professional management methods, sophisticated business strategies, and comprehensive security protocols that make it extremely difficult for law enforcement agencies to investigate or prosecute. The irony is not lost on Carlo that the disaster that was supposed to destroy organized crime in America has instead forced it to evolve into a more sophisticated and ultimately more dangerous form. The crude gangsters who once dominated criminal organizations through violence and intimidation have been replaced by intelligent, educated individuals who understand business, law, and politics well enough to operate successfully in all three arenas. This evolution comes at a cost, however. The colorful, dramatic criminal leaders who captured public imagination through their flamboyant lifestyles and violent methods are disappearing, replaced by quiet, disciplined individuals who attract no attention and generate no headlines. Carlo himself exemplifies this transformation, a man who wields enormous power but appears to be nothing more than a successful businessman enjoying a comfortable retirement. The Apalachin disaster, which initially seemed to spell the end of Carlo Gambino's criminal career, instead becomes the catalyst for his greatest achievements. By forcing him to adapt and evolve, it enables him to build an organization that will survive and prosper long after more dramatic but less adaptable criminal enterprises have been destroyed by their own excesses. As the 1960s progress and American society grapples with unprecedented social and political changes, Carlo Gambino stands ready to lead organized crime into its most successful and enduring era. The quiet shepherd from Sicily has learned to tend his flock in a new and more challenging environment, but his fundamental skills, patience, intelligence, and strategic thinking remain as valuable as ever. There is a peculiar magic in the way true power operates, moving through the world like water, finding its way downhill, following the path of least resistance while gradually wearing away the hardest obstacles. Carlo Gambino, by the late 1960s, has mastered this ancient art of invisible influence, creating a form of leadership so subtle and sophisticated that even those subject to his authority often remain unaware of the forces shaping their decisions. Picture Carlo on a typical evening during this period of his greatest influence, sitting in the modest living room of his Brooklyn home, reading the newspaper while his wife Catherine tends to household matters in the kitchen. The scene appears perfectly ordinary. An elderly Italian-American man, perhaps a retired shopkeeper or small businessman, enjoying the quiet pleasures of domestic life. There are no obvious signs of wealth or power, no bodyguards or bulletproof cars, no dramatic trappings of criminal authority. But in the space of that quiet evening, while Carlo sits reading about political developments and business trends, decisions are being made throughout New York, and beyond that, affect the lives of thousands of people and the flow of millions of dollars. A construction project that seemed destined for costly delays suddenly receives the permits it needs. A labor dispute that threatened to shut down port operations is resolved through mysterious but effective mediation. A businessman facing pressure from loan sharks finds that his problems disappear without explanation or apparent cost. These events appear unconnected to outside observers, but they are all part of an invisible network of influence that operates according to Carlo's strategic vision. Unlike earlier crime bosses who ruled through dramatic displays of authority, Carlo has learned to exercise power so quietly that even his own subordinates sometimes fail to recognize the source of the guidance they are following. This approach to leadership reflects Carlo's deep understanding of human psychology and organizational dynamics. He recognizes that people respond more favorably to suggestions that appear to originate from their own thinking than to direct orders that remind them of their subordinate status. By creating situations where others reach conclusions that align with his strategic objectives, Carlo achieves his goals while allowing others to maintain their dignity and sense of autonomy. The technique requires extraordinary patience and sophisticated understanding of individual motivations, but Carlo has been developing these skills throughout his career. He maintains detailed mental files on the personalities, ambitions, and vulnerabilities of hundreds of individuals. From family members and associates to political figures and business leaders who exist on the periphery of his influence. When Carlo needs a particular outcome in a given situation, he doesn't issue commands or make threats. Instead, he creates conditions that make his preferred outcome appear to be the natural and obvious choice for the people who must actually implement the decision. A union official who needs to resolve a labor dispute finds himself in possession of information that suggests a particular solution. A judge facing a difficult sentencing decision discovers precedents that seem to argue for a specific outcome. A businessman considering various options learns about opportunities and risks that make one choice clearly superior to the alternatives. These interventions require an extensive intelligence network and sophisticated understanding of how information flows through different types of organizations. But Carlo has been building such capabilities for decades. His people occupy strategic positions throughout the legitimate and criminal worlds, providing him with early warning about developing situations and enabling him to influence outcomes before they become public issues. The network operates like a vast nervous system, with thousands of individual contacts and relationships creating channels for information and influence that span multiple industries, government agencies, and social organizations. A secretary in a construction company who happens to be the niece of one of Carlo's associates provides advance notice of bidding opportunities. A clerk in a police department whose gambling debts have been quietly forgiven shares information about planned investigations. A lawyer whose brother received help with a union problem provides legal advice that serves Carlo's interests while remaining completely ethical. Each individual connection appears trivial and innocent, but together they create a web of influence that allows Carlo to anticipate problems, identify opportunities, and shape outcomes across a vast array of activities. The genius of the system lies in its redundancy and deniability. No single individual possesses enough information to understand the full scope of Carlo's influence, and most participants provide their assistance without ever realizing they are part of a larger criminal enterprise. Carlo's leadership style within his own organization reflects the same principles of subtle influence and patient manipulation. Rather than ruling through fear and intimidation like many of his predecessors, he creates an environment where loyalty and competence are rewarded, while disloyalty and incompetence naturally lead to marginalization and irrelevance. His approach to discipline exemplifies this sophisticated method of organizational control. When a family member violates rules or performs poorly, Carlo rarely resorts to direct confrontation or dramatic punishment. Instead, the individual finds himself gradually excluded from important decisions, passed over for lucrative opportunities, and subjected to subtle forms of social pressure that communicate disapproval without requiring explicit criticism. This method proves far more effective than traditional disciplinary approaches because it allows the transgressor to understand the consequences of his actions while providing opportunities for rehabilitation and redemption. Most people, when faced with clear evidence that their behavior is damaging their relationships and opportunities, will modify their conduct to regain acceptance and status within the organization. At the same time, Carlo's system rewards excellence and loyalty in ways that create powerful incentives for superior performance. Family members who demonstrate intelligence, reliability, and discretion find themselves entrusted with increasingly important responsibilities and profitable opportunities. Their success serves as an example to others while building the organizational capabilities that make the family more effective and successful. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Carlo's leadership is his ability to maintain discipline and coordination across a large and complex organization while preserving the autonomy and initiative that make individual members effective. Rather than micromanaging every decision, he establishes clear principles and objectives that allow subordinates to exercise judgment and creativity within acceptable boundaries. This approach requires extraordinary trust and sophisticated selection of personnel, but it creates an organization that is both disciplined and adaptive, capable of responding quickly to changing conditions while maintaining consistency with long-term strategic objectives. Family members understand what is expected of them and possess the authority to act independently within their areas of responsibility, but they also understand that their decisions will be evaluated according to standards that emphasize the organization's overall success rather than individual glory. Carlo's method of conducting business meetings illustrates his mastery of subtle influence and psychological manipulation. Unlike many leaders who use meetings to demonstrate their authority through dramatic displays of knowledge or temperament, Carlo typically says very little during group discussions, instead asking careful questions and making brief observations that guide the conversation toward his preferred conclusions. He has learned that people are more likely to embrace decisions that they believe they have participated in making than those that are simply imposed by authority. By creating opportunities for others to present arguments and analysis that support his strategic objectives, Carlo achieves his goals while making his subordinates feel valued and respected as contributors to the decision-making process. This technique requires detailed preparation and sophisticated understanding of group dynamics, but it creates a level of buy-in and commitment that cannot be achieved through simple command and control methods. When family members believe that their input has been considered and their expertise has contributed to important decisions, they are far more likely to implement those decisions effectively and enthusiastically. By the early 1970s, Carlo's mastery of invisible leadership has created an organization that operates with a level of efficiency and effectiveness that amazes law enforcement officials and criminal competitors alike. The Gambino family under his leadership generates enormous profits while maintaining remarkably low visibility, avoids internal conflicts that destroy other criminal organizations, and adapts successfully to changing legal and social conditions that defeat less sophisticated competitors. Most importantly, Carlo has created an organizational culture that emphasizes long-term thinking over short-term gains, strategic planning over impulsive action, and collective success over individual glory. This culture will prove to be his greatest legacy, enabling his organization to survive and prosper long after his death, and providing a model for criminal leadership that will influence organized crime for generations to come. The quiet shepherd from Sicily has perfected the art of leading without appearing to lead, of commanding without giving orders, and of building an empire while remaining almost invisible to those who study power and its exercise. In an age when leadership is often confused with celebrity and power is measured by public recognition, Carlo Gambino represents a different and ultimately more effective approach to the exercise of authority. Time moves differently in the final chapters of a great man's life, each day carrying the weight of accumulated wisdom, while shadows lengthen toward an inevitable sunset. For Carlo Gambino, the 1970s arrived like autumn in his personal seasons, bringing both the harvest of decades of patient cultivation and the quiet acknowledgement that even the most carefully tended gardens must eventually pass to other hands. By 1975, Carlo has reached his 73rd year, an age when most men think of retirement, grandchildren, and the simple pleasures of a life well lived. But Carlo Gambino is not most men, and the empire he has built through 5 decades of strategic brilliance cannot simply be walked away from like a corner grocery store or neighborhood barbershop. The organization that bears his name has become too large, too complex, and too interwoven with the fabric of American society to be abandoned without careful preparation for succession. The challenge facing Carlo in these final years is perhaps the most complex of his remarkable career: how to transfer power in a criminal organization while maintaining the stability, discipline, and strategic vision that have made his family the most successful and enduring in American organized crime. Unlike legitimate businesses, crime families cannot simply hire outside executives or implement formal succession planning processes. The transition must be accomplished while avoiding both internal warfare and external challenges from rivals who might see leadership change as an opportunity for expansion or conquest. Carlo's approach to this final challenge reflects all the wisdom and patience that have characterized his entire career. Rather than simply designating a successor and withdrawing from active leadership, he begins a gradual process of power transfer that allows potential successors to demonstrate their capabilities while maintaining overall organizational continuity and effectiveness. The process reveals Carlo's deep understanding of the human dynamics that make criminal organizations successful or cause them to destroy themselves. He recognizes that simple bloodline succession, while traditional in Sicilian culture, may not produce the best leadership for a modern American crime family. At the same time, he understands that completely abandoning family connections could weaken the personal loyalties that hold the organization together during periods of stress and challenge. His solution characteristically balances competing considerations while serving the organization's long-term interests. Paul Castellano, his brother-in-law, possesses the intelligence and strategic thinking necessary for effective leadership, but lacks the street credibility and operational experience that command respect from the family soldiers and crew leaders. Neil Delacroce, his long-serving underboss, commands enormous respect throughout the organization and possesses deep operational knowledge, but represents the old school of criminal leadership that may not be well suited to the increasingly sophisticated challenges of modern organized crime. Rather than choosing between these alternatives, Carlo creates a power-sharing arrangement that allows both men to contribute their strengths while compensating for their respective weaknesses. Castellano is positioned to handle the family's increasingly complex legitimate business interests and political relationships, while Delacroce maintains responsibility for traditional criminal operations and internal discipline. This arrangement requires extraordinary diplomatic skill to implement and maintain, but Carlo's decades of experience in managing complex relationships serve him well. Both men respect his judgment and understand that their own long-term success depends on maintaining organizational stability and effectiveness rather than pursuing personal ambitions at the expense of collective interests. The succession planning also reflects Carlo's recognition that the nature of organized crime is continuing to evolve in ways that will require new types of leadership skills and organizational capabilities. The crude methods that characterized earlier generations of criminal leaders are becoming increasingly obsolete as law enforcement agencies develop more sophisticated investigative techniques, and American society becomes less tolerant of obvious criminal activity. Future crime family leaders will need to operate more like corporate executives than traditional gangsters, managing complex business enterprises while maintaining the discipline and loyalty that make criminal organizations effective. They will need sophisticated understanding of law, finance, and technology, as well as the ability to build and maintain relationships across multiple legitimate and illegitimate communities. Carlo's own career provides a template for this evolution, demonstrating how a man can rise from humble immigrant origins to control vast criminal enterprises while avoiding the dramatic excesses that typically lead to imprisonment or violent death. His methods, patience over aggression, intelligence over intimidation, strategic thinking over impulsive action, represent a model of criminal leadership that will remain relevant long after the specific techniques and circumstances of his era have become historical curiosities. As Carlo's health begins to decline in the mid-1970s, he uses his remaining energy to ensure that the lessons of his career are preserved and transmitted to the next generation of family leadership. This educational process takes many forms, from informal conversations during family gatherings to more structured discussions about specific challenges and opportunities facing the organization. The conversations reveal Carlo's extraordinary breadth of knowledge and his ability to extract general principles from specific experiences. He discusses not just the mechanics of criminal operations, but the underlying psychology of power relationships, the sociology of ethnic communities, the economics of illegal markets, and the politics of law enforcement and government regulation. His analysis of successful criminal leadership emphasizes characteristics that extend far beyond the traditional gangster virtues of toughness and loyalty. He stresses the importance of intellectual curiosity, emotional self-control, strategic patience, and the ability to build and maintain trust relationships with people from all walks of life. Most importantly, he emphasizes that successful criminal leaders must understand their role as servants of their organizations rather than masters of them. This servant leadership philosophy reflects Carlo's understanding that criminal organizations, like all human institutions, survive and prosper only when their leaders focus on collective success rather than personal aggrandizement. Leaders who use their positions primarily to serve their own interests inevitably create conditions that lead to internal conflict, external challenges, and ultimate organizational failure. Carlo's emphasis on this principle stems from his observation of numerous criminal leaders who destroyed themselves and their organizations through selfishness, arrogance, and short-term thinking. He has watched powerful men fall because they forgot that their authority derived from their ability to serve their followers' interests rather than their own. And he is determined that his own successors will not repeat these fatal mistakes. The final years of Carlo's active leadership also provide opportunities for him to reflect on the broader implications of his career and the role of organized crime in American society. His perspective on these larger questions reveals a sophisticated understanding of social and economic forces that extends far beyond the narrow concerns of criminal enterprise. Carlo recognizes that organized crime exists because it serves functions that legitimate institutions either cannot or will not perform. In a society where official law enforcement is often corrupt or ineffective, where legitimate businesses sometimes fail to meet consumer demands, and where political systems may not adequately represent all citizens' interests, criminal organizations provide alternative mechanisms for conflict resolution, service delivery, and interest representation. This analysis does not represent an attempt to justify criminal activity, but rather a realistic assessment of the social conditions that create opportunities for criminal entrepreneurs. Carlo understands that as long as these conditions persist, some form of organized crime will continue to exist regardless of law enforcement efforts or moral condemnation. At the same time, Carlo recognizes that the specific forms taken by criminal organizations must evolve as society changes. The crude violence and obvious corruption that characterize earlier eras of organized crime are becoming counterproductive as American society becomes more prosperous, educated, and capable of effective collective action against clear criminal threats. Future criminal organizations will need to operate with greater sophistication and subtlety, providing genuinely valuable services while avoiding the dramatic excesses that attract unwanted attention and social opposition. They will need leaders who understand not just criminal techniques, but also legitimate business practices, legal procedures, and political processes. On October 15, 1976, Carlo Gambino dies quietly at his home in Brooklyn, surrounded by family members and a few close associates. His death attracts remarkably little media attention, reflecting his lifelong success at avoiding the public notoriety that characterized many of his contemporaries. The obituaries describe him as a successful businessman and devoted family man, making little reference to his role as one of the most powerful criminal leaders in American history. But within the shadowy world where his true influence was felt, Carlo's death marks the end of an era. He had transformed American organized crime from a collection of ethnic gangs into sophisticated criminal enterprises, capable of operating successfully in modern American society. His methods and philosophy will influence criminal leadership for generations, providing a template for building and maintaining criminal organizations that can survive and prosper in an increasingly complex and challenging environment. Perhaps most remarkably, the organization Carlo built proves capable of surviving his death and continuing to operate effectively under new leadership. This institutional continuity, rare among criminal enterprises, represents the ultimate vindication of his approach to organizational development and succession planning. The Gambino crime family will continue to be one of America's most powerful and enduring criminal organizations for decades after Carlo's death, a living monument to his strategic vision and leadership capabilities. The quiet shepherd from Sicily had built something that transcended his own mortal limitations, creating an institution that would carry his influence forward through time, long after his name had faded from public memory. In the end, Carlo Gambino's greatest achievement may have been his demonstration that criminal leadership, like leadership in any field, requires intelligence, patience, and genuine concern for the welfare of those being led. His career proves that even in the immoral world of organized crime, success ultimately depends on character, competence, and the ability to inspire loyalty through service rather than fear. The shadows that concealed his empire during his lifetime continue to protect his legacy, ensuring that the full story of his remarkable career may never be completely known. But for those who understand the subtle dynamics of power and influence, Carlo Gambino represents a masterclass in leadership that transcends the specific circumstances of his criminal career and offers insights relevant to anyone who seeks to understand how extraordinary individuals shape the world around them through patience, intelligence, and strategic thinking. As night falls and our journey through his story draws toward its close, we are left with the image of a small, quiet man who understood that true power whispers rather than shouts, that lasting influence flows from service rather than domination, and that the greatest leaders are often those who remain invisible to history while shaping its course through their patient cultivation of human relationships and institutional capabilities. Carlo Gambino, the eternal shepherd, had tended his flock with such skill that it continued to thrive long after he had returned to the ancient Sicilian earth that first shaped his character and vision. His was a life lived in shadows, but one that cast light on timeless truths about leadership, loyalty, and the complex relationship between individual ambition and collective achievement. And so, dear night travelers, we reach the end of our quiet journey through the shadows of one of the 20th century's most enigmatic figures, Carlo Gambino, a name that whispers through history like smoke through darkened alleys, carrying with it the essence of an area when power moved in silence and influence flowed like water, finding its natural course. We have walked together through 8 decades of American transformation, following the footsteps of a small Sicilian shepherd who became the architect of modern organized crime. From the dusty hills of Palermo to the gleaming towers of Manhattan, from the chaos of prohibition to the sophisticated criminal enterprises of the modern era, Carlo's story illuminates not just the evolution of organized crime, but the deeper currents of ambition, loyalty, and strategic thinking that shape all human endeavors. What strikes me most profoundly about Carlo Gambino's life is not his criminal achievements, but his mastery of timeless principles that extend far beyond the specific world in which he operated. His understanding that patience trumps aggression, that service builds stronger loyalty than fear, that intelligence matters more than intimidation. These insights resonate with anyone who seeks to understand how extraordinary individuals leave lasting marks on the world. But I find myself wondering, as we drift toward the end of this tale, what you make of Carlo Gambino. Was he simply a criminal mastermind who perfected the art of illegal enterprise? Or was he something more complex, a man whose intelligence and strategic vision might have led to great achievements in any field he chose to enter? Did his circumstances shape his choices, or did his character create his destiny? These are questions without easy answers, and perhaps that ambiguity is part of what makes his story so compelling. Carlo Gambino existed in the gray areas between good and evil, between legal and illegal, between service and exploitation. He built an empire on activities that harmed individuals and corrupted institutions. But he did so with methods that emphasized loyalty, discipline, and long-term thinking over the crude violence that characterized most criminal enterprises. In the end, perhaps the most important lesson from Carlo's remarkable career is that leadership in any field, for any purpose, requires the same fundamental qualities: the ability to understand people, to build trust, to think strategically, and to put collective interests ahead of personal desires. The specific arena in which these qualities are exercised determines whether they create good or evil, but the qualities themselves remain constant across all human endeavors. As our story concludes, I'm curious to hear your thoughts. What aspects of Carlo Gambino's story resonated most strongly with you tonight? Did you find yourself admiring his intelligence and strategic thinking? Or were you more struck by the moral complexity of a life lived in the shadows between legal and illegal activity? And where in the world has this quiet journey found you tonight? Are you drifting toward sleep in a cozy bedroom somewhere in North America? Or perhaps watching the dawn break over a European city? Maybe you're somewhere in Asia, finding peace in this tale as another day begins. Your presence here, wherever you are, makes this story complete. If this long journey through the shadows has brought you some measure of peace or fascination, I would be deeply grateful if you would take a moment to let me know with a gentle like. And if you haven't already joined our community of night wanderers and story seekers, consider subscribing for more tales that unfold slowly in the darkness, designed for those who find comfort in the complex narratives of history's most compelling figures. Thank you for walking with me tonight through the remarkable life of Carlo Gambino, the quiet godfather. Thank you for your patience with this long tale, for your willingness to explore the gray areas of human nature, and for finding in these shadows the kind of peace that only comes from understanding that even the most extraordinary lives are built from ordinary human desires for respect, security, and significance. Rest well wherever this night finds you, and remember that sometimes the most powerful forces in the world are the ones that move so quietly we barely notice their presence, shaping history through whispers rather than shouts, through patience rather than drama, through the kind of strategic thinking that turns ordinary men into legends. Good night, and sweet dreams filled with the quiet wisdom of shepherds who understand that true power lies not in commanding others, but in serving something larger than themselves. Where in the world are you falling asleep to this story tonight?